Okay, let's get started. If one day you were sitting in a chair and watched one of the videos of astronauts on the International Space Station floating in space and doing some acrobatic movements, so you say to yourself, "That's cool, I want to become an astronaut." Well, you are completely wrong, and I will tell you why. Exploration is one of human natures, which has shaped our present today with all the progress and development we are witnessing. And the dream of space exploration was the craziest dream, and it needed people who were geniuses and crazy enough to believe that this dream could be implemented. Scientists, engineers, and astronauts, like Yuri Gagarin, who was the first person to ascend into outer space. Not only that, but he was the first person to experience zero gravity and free fall without ending up as scrambled eggs. On September 12, 1962, in the midst of the Cold War, the space race began when President John Kennedy announced that the United States of America was seeking to send astronauts to the moon in response to the Soviet Union and the flight of Yuri Gagarin. And he said his famous words: "We chose to go there not because it is easy, but because it is hard." After years of research and a great effort by scientists, engineers, and astronauts, and experiments during which people were injured and some people even died to achieve this goal, and after delaying the launch date more than once, the efforts of the United States of America succeeded and the Apollo 11 mission to the moon was launched. Once the spacecraft reaches the moon, the lunar module separates from the command module and lands on the moon's surface with Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong in it. And they received most of the praise, especially Neil Armstrong, who was the first human to step on the moon. As the years passed and space research progressed, many countries began to establish their own space programs, such as China, India, European countries, and others. Although there are many space agencies, they rarely open their doors to appoint new members as astronauts. But after a long wait, one of the agencies opens its doors for applications. And you rush there and find yourself waiting in a long line with about 18,000 other applicants. Just like what happened in 2016 at NASA. Only a small number of applicants are accepted as candidates for the tests, and the rest are rejected, and you may be among those rejected. But if a miracle happens and you are accepted, you will be subjected to a series of precise mental, physical, and psychological tests. For example, there is a set of physical tests that are performed on the candidate, such as blood pressure, heart rate, fitness tests, and others to ensure that your health is very good. As well as height tests to be suitable for the spacesuit, and certainly eyesight tests. Look at the board. What board? The board on the wall. Is there a wall too? In addition to the fact that one of the conditions for acceptance as a candidate is that you must be highly educated, there are several mental and scientific tests to ensure the candidate's ability to solve problems. So you must develop your knowledge in mathematics, physics, engineering, and computer science. Also, one of the important conditions for accepting candidates is that they must have at least 3 years of flying experience or 1,000 hours of flying an aircraft. And if we assume that you passed all of these tests, you will still have the psychological tests. Each space agency has a set of psychological tests for candidates to determine some personal qualities such as patience, emotional stability, and the ability to cooperate to solve problems. And these qualities cannot be known from the personal interview alone. For example, the Japanese Space Agency selects 10 candidates, locks them up for a week in an isolated facility, and subjects them to strange tests. They ask them to make 1,000 origami papers in the shape of a bird and tie these shapes together with a long thread. These origami shapes are sent in boxes to psychiatrists to analyze them and determine which of the candidates continued to perform the task with the same efficiency and which of them rushed and the quality of their work decreased over time. All of these are important factors in selecting astronauts because in long space flights, every task in the flight is repeated, and it becomes a boring routine task. Another test conducted by the Japanese Space Agency on candidates is disrupting the bathroom or delaying serving food. NASA would sometimes telephone candidates at late hours and summon them to see their reaction, and whether they would show up quickly or argue and be late. This showed some qualities of seriousness and responsibility. And if you pass all of these tests, you may be rejected for a strange reason, such as that you snore while sleeping. This may be very annoying for your crew and lead to poor sleep quality during the mission, which in turn affects concentration. After you pass these tests and say to yourself, "Finally, I will rest a little," I'm sorry to tell you that it is only the beginning. You have now become a trainee as an astronaut and will enter an intensive training program on flying airplanes, submerging underwater to practice in zero gravity to carry out certain missions, training on using computer programs designated for missions, and training on the flight simulator at NASA for long periods of time, and lots of other exercises. Now that you have finished your training, I can say congratulations to you. You have officially become an astronaut, and you will be chosen to carry out your first mission and go into space. This is where the real danger begins. Despite scientific progress and our great success in most space missions, not all missions succeed. Any small mistake could lead to catastrophic results. We have seen missiles explode in the air before, such as the tragic Challenger mission. Elon Musk had 2 rockets explode before he succeeded the 3rd time. Another example of this is what happened on the Apollo 13 mission, when the team was surprised by a huge explosion during the flight, and astronaut Jim Lovell said his terrifying sentence,
Houston, we've had a problem.
This explosion was for the oxygen tank that they would be breathing throughout the trip, and now it has exploded. Fortunately, they had enough oxygen until they returned, but the biggest problem was their inability to get rid of carbon dioxide. But the command center on Earth managed the crisis well and were able to come up with a solution to the problem. When investigating this matter, it became clear that what happened was not the result of one reason, but rather several reasons that led to the problem occurring. Fortunately, the problem was solved, and the spacecraft and those on it returned to Earth safely. But this was not always the case. For example, on April 23, 1967, the Soviet Union decided to conduct a space maneuver in which it would launch a spacecraft containing astronaut Vladimir Komarov, and then launch another spacecraft containing 3 astronauts. At a certain altitude, the 2 spacecraft will connect together, and 2 of the 3 astronauts will head to the first spacecraft, then the 2 spacecraft will separate and return to Earth. But before the mission was launched, when Komarov and backup astronaut Yuri Gagarin checked the spacecraft, it was found that there were more than 200 malfunctions. But because they were in the Soviet Union and in the middle of a Cold War and a space race, the mission had to be carried out. Therefore, the first spacecraft was launched, and from here, the disaster began. The first problem that occurred was with the solar panels, so the spacecraft lost half its power. And because of this malfunction, the rest of the mission was stopped, and Major Komarov was left trying to solve the problems. And every time he finished one problem, another problem appeared. But with unparalleled skill, he was able to solve all the problems and successfully direct the spacecraft to return to Earth. But unfortunately, a final malfunction occurred. The parachute that was supposed to open to help him land did not open, and the result was that the spacecraft hit the ground hard and exploded. Major Komarov died, and the Soviet Union lost one of its most brilliant astronauts. I feel, my friend, that you are afraid. Don't be. Let me reassure you that these are rare events. Today, spaceflight is very safe, so you can go on your trip without worrying. But what you should worry about is the length of the flight, which may take months and sometimes may exceed a year, which affects the health condition of the astronaut. For example, with the disappearance of gravity, the effect of the human body's weight on his muscles and bones decreases, and thus the brain begins to direct calcium and nutrients to places other than the bones and muscles, so the body begins to lose muscle and decrease bone density. There are studies that say that astronauts who perform missions for a period longer than 6 months are exposed to bone loss equivalent to 20 years on Earth, which means a loss of 15% to 20% of bone density. This means that if an astronaut is 30 years old when he launches into spaceflight, will return after 6 months, and his bones are like the bones of a 50-year-old person. But the good news is that the body can rebuild muscles and bones over time, but they never return as before. So the best solution to avoid muscle and bone loss is to exercise with weights. But the lack of gravity makes it an impractical idea. Therefore, astronauts use treadmill to exercise in space, and they are attached to the treadmill with ropes to keep the astronauts on them. And they use resistance bands instead of weights. This is one of the health effects, but not all of them. There are effects on blood pressure, body fluids, balance, and more. The length of the trip not only has an impact on the human body, but also on his psychological state. The astronaut remains isolated with 1 or 2 people in a narrow place for long periods, and this creates a psychological state that scientists call irrational antagonism. This means that if you stay in isolation for longer than a month and a half with someone, you will find yourself feuding with this person without any logical reason, and creating problems with him for ridiculous reasons, to the point that you hate that this person in front of you even breathes. In 1987, astronauts Yuri Romanenko and Alexander Levakin launched to the Mir space station on a 326-day mission. The space station was cramped and their bedroom was small. Imagine with this narrow space and the psychological pressure they were exposed to for a long time. Any wrong behavior might start a quarrel at a distance of 374 kilometers from Earth, and there was no one to intervene to stop the quarrel. Actually, it would be a disaster if anyone intervened between them, because it will be an alien. But this quarrel did not happen. Alexander was saying that Yuri was older than him in age and rank, and was the leader of the mission, and this set clear lines in the way they dealt with each other. Likewise, Yuri used a trick when feeling angry when a problem occurred. He would scold and blame the flight control center on Earth. In fact, most astronauts use this trick to vent their feelings of anger. In addition to irrational hostility, long space missions are routine and boring, and this increases psychological stress. Likewise, being away from family and friends for long periods has a major psychological impact. Sudden malfunctions in flights are a possibility, and when they occur, it may require one of the crew members to leave to repair them. It must always be connected to the spacecraft with a specific rope because due to the lack of gravity, friction, and air resistance, any simple push may throw you into space without returning. In the end, my friend, why with all these risks would someone choose such a job? It is the love of exploration with which we began the video, the curiosity to know the unknown that has led humanity to every progress it has made, from the discovery of fire to agriculture to ascension into space. And for money and fame too. At the beginning of World War II, both the German and Soviet armies faced a problem. It is that the rifles with which they fight are old and heavy, which limits the movement of the soldiers and prevents them from carrying sufficient ammunition with them, and therefore they were running out of ammunition. The weapon's recoil is so strong that it can dislocate a soldier's shoulder when using it, and it has many malfunctions and is complicated to use. The Soviets tried to solve this problem by relying on the human element, by training soldiers in shooting and aiming. And they developed the Mosin-Nagant rifle, which they used to become a sniper weapon. Therefore, during war, out of every 10 skilled snipers, 9 of them are Soviets. As for the Germans, they relied on developing the machine itself by manufacturing automatic rifles called the MP-40, which guarantees a density of bullets and success in direct combat, even if other features such as accuracy and the long range of the projectile are lost. In the Battle of Bryansk, the Soviets noticed how humble their weapons were compared to the German weapons. And this is what prompted Sergeant Mikhail Kalashnikov, who participated in the battle as a tank commander and was wounded during it, to think about designing a weapon to confront the German weapons, especially since the Germans produced a more effective weapon called the STG-44, or storm gun, which Hitler considered hope to win the war. Kalashnikov believed that what hindered the development of Russian weapons was the search for idealism. So he relied on the principle that idealism is the enemy of good enough. He designed a weapon caliber of 7.62 by 39 millimeter, which is a medium caliber and weighs much less than the old rifle. This allowed soldiers to carry larger quantities of ammunition. The weight of the rifle itself, when fully loaded, reaches 4.3 kilograms, which is much lighter than its predecessors. Also, the range of the rifle is less than the old rifles, and you may think that this is a defect. But in a direct engagement, you do not need a sniper weapon, but rather cover fire and a density in the number of shots. And remember the principle that ideality is the enemy of good enough. Kalashnikov also noted the difficulty of learning to use old weapons, with many soldiers dying as a result of misuse. So he designed a weapon consisting of several parts, each part having a specific place like puzzle pieces. Any child over 8 years old can learn to disassemble, assemble, and use this weapon within 1 hour of training. Kalashnikov relied on his practical mechanical experience, which he gained from his work maintaining tractors in Siberia, in an unforgiving environment and weather conditions, and his work on an army tank to design a weapon that has few malfunctions, is easy to maintain, works under the most difficult conditions, and has a shelf life of 20 to 40 years. In addition to its ease of manufacture, its cheap price made this weapon a revolutionary weapon in the field of military manufacturing. But so far, this weapon is just a design and idea that has not yet been implemented. After the end of World War II, the Soviet Union did not abandon the project to develop automatic rifles that it had begun during the war. So Stalin unusually held a competition for anyone who could apply to design an effective automatic weapon similar to the German weapon. Kalashnikov seized the opportunity and applied for the competition, and despite being a sergeant who had not received formal education in armament engineering, he was accepted. After several attempts, Kalashnikov and his team were able to manufacture the first copy of the AK-47 weapon, short for Automatic Kalashnikov 1947. This weapon not only outperformed the contestants who were weapons experts, which prompted some of them to withdraw before displaying their weapons, but it also outperformed the German weapon. The success of this weapon made the Soviet army adopt it as an official army weapon and consider it a war secret. But there are several waves of the spread of this weapon throughout the world. The first of these waves was the result of the formation of NATO, which prompted the Soviets to create a counter-alliance, the Warsaw Pact, in 1955. Now it was necessary for the Soviets to arm their allies, so they supplied them with large quantities of AK-47. But the Soviet factories did not have sufficient capacity to produce these large quantities, so the Soviets granted their allies a license to manufacture Kalashnikovs locally. This has made this weapon spread widely to the point that there are estimates indicating that its number has reached 100 million weapons, half of which were manufactured outside Russia. This deployment was a test of the weapon's efficiency in different environments, and it passed the test with distinction. For example, in the Vietnam War, it was used by untrained Viet Cong farmers, and American soldiers used the M16 weapon. They were surprised by the inefficiency of the American weapon in Vietnam's muddy and humid environment full of swamps and forests. This weapon suffered from many malfunctions and required constant maintenance, while the AK-47 did not suffer from all of these malfunctions, to the point that American soldiers were waiting to kill any of the Vietnamese fighters in order to take his weapon and use it. And this matter was described as a scandal at the time. The second wave of the spread of this weapon was when the Soviets created the AK-74, which is a better and more efficient version of the AK-47. This made it an old weapon. The Soviet Union decided to put large quantities of the old AK-47 on sale, and this weapon became widespread not only in regular armies, but also in rebellious movements, armed militias, gangs, drug cartels, and the mafia. The third wave of the spread of this weapon was in 1979 when the Soviet Union decided to invade Afghanistan. The Afghan fighters, who were called Mujahideen at the time, asked the American intelligence to provide them with a K-47 to confront the Soviet invasion. Indeed, CIA officials in Pakistan implement this request and import Russian Kalashnikov weapons from China and give them to Afghan fighters. After that, the United States of America will remain one of the largest importers and distributors of Kalashnikovs. Can you imagine this? And for the first time, the Soviets saw the Kalashnikov being used against them. The fourth and most violent wave of the spread of the Kalashnikov weapon occurred during the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. This led to the disappearance of 80% of the Soviet light weapons arsenal, most of which were Kalashnikov weapons. Some senior leaders and officers sold these weapons to rebel movements in Asia, Africa, and all areas of armed conflict in the world, and these leaders became called the war rich. The ease of using the Kalashnikov and its efficiency in various environments and circumstances made it the weapon of choice for rebels and gangs that use children as fighters in their ranks. And also because it is cheap in some African countries, it was possible to obtain a Kalashnikov in exchange for a cow, or even a chicken, or for free in exchange for joining the militias. If we ask anyone what is the most dangerous weapon in the world, his answer would naturally be the nuclear bomb. But the spread of firearms in the world, whose number is estimated at about 500 million weapons, including about 100 million Kalashnikovs, has made them surpass all bombs and missiles in terms of the number of victims. Estimates say that there are about 250,000 victims who have fallen as a result of nuclear weapons in the world so far, while about 200,000 victims of firearms fall victim every year. And let me remind you that 1/5 of the rifles in the world are of the Kalashnikov type. Mikhail Kalashnikov continued to defend himself throughout his life and believed that he had done what he should have done for his country. But at the end of his life, when he saw his weapons in the hands of children and terrorists, he regretted and wished he had not invented this weapon. And he sent a letter to the Russian church asking whether he would bear the guilt of the thousands of lives victimized by his weapons as a Christian believer. And he signed the letter not with his honorary title, but as Slave of God, the designer Mikhail Kalashnikov. But there is a question, why did Kalashnikov not do with the profits from his weapons like Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite, who was called the Merchant of Death because of this invention, and gave a prize for peace and scientific achievement to ease his conscience? Let me remind you that Kalashnikov lived in the Soviet Union, the stronghold of communism. All profits from his weapons went to the state, while he lived poor, relying on a pension allocated to him by the state. It would not be surprised if you found him in a queue for subsidized goods or on a public transport bus. And he did not receive a respectable sum of money until he sold the rights to his name to some local brands such as vodka, and he was 85 years old at the time. Mikhail Kalashnikov died on December 23, 2013, after a long life that began as a national hero and then became an example of the saying, either you die a hero or you live a long time to become the villain of the story.